If I were to ask you to name something that could end the world, what would you say? I assume it would be something to the effect of an asteroid or global warming, gray goo, or even artificial intelligence. The idea of a flood ending the world, though, probably didn't make your list. Noah-esque flood myths are common across many cultures. When the world you know and could reasonably travel to was small, a flood sweeping it all away didn't seem that unlikely. Much like how during the Cold War, a lot of Americans were fearful of a nuclear war ending the world. Many had just lived through at least one destructive and deadly world conflict, and another involving nuclear powers didn't seem that unlikely. Flooding was a somewhat common occurrence for many early civilizations. When something is that common, it would be easy to believe that a flood larger than normal could end everything. Rivers as a whole, however, were great for early civilizations. Rivers contain a source of fresh water to drink and bathe in, wild game to hunt, and a source of transportation. It was far easier to travel via boat than overland for much of history. Floods would also deposit silt yearly, which helped replenish nutrients to fields that crops needed, as well as give the crops moisture to grow. Because of these reasons, many of the early civilizations in the world formed around rivers. In this video, we're going to cover one of them, Mesopotamia. Around 12,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer groups first started settling the Fertile Crescent. These groups became among the first people to develop agriculture. Mesopotamia was the name given to the region by the Greeks, meaning land between the rivers. The two rivers being the Tigris and Euphrates, and they offered a great place to early farmers to grow crops. Farming settlements began to form as early as 7000 BCE. Farmers grew grain like barley and wheat, and also raised livestock. One thing to keep in mind, archaeologists and historians are unsure as to why people moved to agriculture. Like now, it seems like it's a no-brainer, but at the time... Initially, hunter-gatherers were much healthier. First, they had a more varied diet and access to a wider range of nutrition. Early farmers were also limited in what they ate, often just a few varieties of crops and livestock. Hunter-gatherers also had way better teeth. People used to eat a lot of grain, and still do, really. To make grain easier to eat, we grind it. Back in ancient times, people would use a stone tool called a mortar and pestle. Along with grain, the mortar and pestle would wear away a little bit each time it was used. This would introduce grit into their food, which would wear away at their teeth. Farming as a whole wasn't easy in Mesopotamia either. While the ground may have been fertile, the region is semi-arid, receiving less than 10 inches of rain a year. So farmers relied on the rivers to flood and provide silt, as well as irrigation water. The flooding, however, was very unpredictable. Because the headwaters of the Tigris and the Euphrates start in modern-day Turkey and Kurdistan, the people in Mesopotamia didn't know what type of precipitation those regions had received over the winter and early spring. In addition, the timing of floods varied. It could come as early as April, as late as June, or sometimes not even at all. As I mentioned earlier, and I think it goes without saying, floods could be bad. Mesopotamia is a fairly flat region, so water would spread out once it spilled over the banks. Crops, livestock, and even villages could be swept away. At any rate, these settlements grew into one of the first civilizations. We define civilization as an organized and complex society with different social classes. Other features of a civilization also include writing, formal education, art, and architecture. By 6000 BCE, Mesopotamians also overcame many of their flooding woes by creating irrigation systems. They would dig reservoirs and cisterns to hold water supplies. They also would build canals that would divert water to the cisterns. From these canals, they also built a system of ditches that would allow water to irrigate crops. These could also be used to divert floodwaters. They also built up the banks of the rivers to prevent it from spilling over, as well as dams that could be used to hold back some of the water. The best thing about irrigation for farmers is it allowed them to give their crops the amount of water they need when they need it, even if it didn't rain. This increased yields and created a surplus of food, or more than what they needed. This in turn led to divisional labor. Because it took less people to grow enough food for everyone, some people didn't have to farm anymore. Instead, people could focus on other things like art, metalworking, and academics. It also made more people available to work on large projects. These large projects required more organization. which may have created a need for rulers to organize the community. Some of the first leaders in Mesopotamian communities were priests. Gods were some of the most important figures in Mesopotamia. Throughout history, many cultures found it much easier to explain the natural world with gods and myths. So naturally, the Mesopotamians created gods that caused different phenomena like flooding. And they did create a flood god, and his name was Enlil. And he was also their chief god. With a god as fickle as Enlil, who once flooded the entire world because humans were being too noisy, if you knew someone who was close to him or could speak to him on your behalf, that person would naturally be very important. Hence why priests became some of the earliest governors. People also found the need for keeping track of how much grain they possessed or had traded. And so one of the world's first writing systems also began being developed. It started out as simple pictures pressed into clay tablets. However, as time went on, it became a very robust writing system, and it was even flexible enough to be adapted into a dozen different languages. They also devised a base 60 math system. Keep in mind, we have a base 10 system. Imagine having to learn to count to 60 and not repeat a single number. This system was extremely precise in figuring angles for their building projects, as well as allowing them to accurately map the nighttime sky. Over time, Mesopotamian settlements grew, gradually developing into cities between 4000 and 3000 BCE. Cities were increasingly becoming more important. People could trade their goods, as well as provide a location to store some of their surplus food. Cities also became the political, religious, cultural, and economic centers for civilization. Though, despite the growth of these cities, most people still worked farm jobs. Secular leaders also began appearing as well. These leaders were likely either rich landowners or military leaders. And eventually they also started assuming some religious duties as well. And this leads us to one of the first civilizations in the world, Mesopotamia. Anyways, please consider liking and subscribing, and until next time, I will miss you all terribly. Wait for the ambulance. Bougie like Applebee's.